Our agenda, we're going to start with just some brief introductions so you know who's talking at you, and then provide a background on both the Clean Water Initiative program and then specifically the Clean Water Workforce Capacity Development Project. I'll be giving that background, and then I will be passing it over to Jess to talk more specifically about the Phase 1 assessment, both the methodology, some preliminary findings, and then we'll wrap up with next steps and leave some space for Q&A. We haven't been able to practice together. I don't think it'll take the full 2 hours. Hopefully it won't, but we certainly want to make some time for Q&A at the end. But please pop your questions in the chat along the way, and we'll make sure to go back and look at that chat during that time so that we can capture your questions. So to start off with, I am Gianna Petito. I am the grants coordinator for the Clean Water Initiative program. I've been so for about 1.5 years. Prior to this, I was the district manager for the Winooski Natural Resources District, so organizational capacity is a subject near and dear to my heart personally. In this position, I oversee development of CWIP's spending plan, which does communicate how CWIP will distribute the annual funds that we receive through the clean water budgeting process, how we disseminate that into our various granting programs. I also oversee development of our funding policy, which provides guidance to our grantees on eligible uses of our funds. I'm really honored to be the technical project manager for this initiative because I'm really excited about it. And I want to thank some of my team members who have helped us get us to this point and will continue to support this project moving forward. What that does mean, though, is that I'll be point person in terms of budgeting for this project and also trying to help structure how the funds will get spent as this project evolves. So I'll pass it over to Jess to introduce herself too.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jess Weimer, and I'm an associate at the Clark Group, LLC, and I'm the project manager for the contractor team that was selected by CWIP to help them with Phase 1 of this initiative.
Great. Thank you, Jess. All right, so a little bit of background for anyone who's unfamiliar with the Clean Water Initiative program. Who is CWIP? So this is our mission statement up here. We facilitate the restoration of Vermont's natural resources through meaningful clean water investments. You can see by our picture, we're a team of passionate people. I would highlight that our mission statement maybe has 2 kind of key phrases for me personally. One is facilitate. I think that really highlights the key role that our partners play in this, that we need our partners. And the other is the phrase meaningful clean water investments, making sure that our investments have an impact. And I'll circle back around to that about why I feel this particular initiative is really critical to helping us achieve that. We are part of the governmental alphabet soup, if that is helpful for anyone. As you can see, CWIP is all the way to the right. We're in the Water Investment Division, in Department for Environmental Conservation, in the Agency of Natural Resources. And the Clean Water Initiative does actually exist in statute. I'm providing in the chat link to statute if you are interested. But one of the purposes of the Clean Water Initiative is to provide the financing necessary to achieve and maintain compliance with Vermont's water quality standards. So big picture, providing funding to protect and restore Vermont's waters so that we meet these state water quality standards. We group our work kind of into 4 pillars. One of our big chunks of work that our team does is budgeting. We manage dollars from a range of different sources, some of it coming through the Clean Water Board and the budgeting process, but some coming from other sources as well, as you can see on the slide. So we coordinate with state departments to receive forecasted revenues, work with different decision-making bodies to build these budgets. In the second column, CWIP gets some of these funds directly into our program and we administer them into granting programs. So we oversee sort of the administration of those funds. We develop, again, the spending plan and funding policy. We try to set up how these projects get prioritized to be in alignment with the state's tactical basin planning process. We help folks kind of develop requests for proposals and grant agreements and contracts, all to administer the funds that we receive as a program. Another portion of our team does a lot of work in tracking and reporting. Another big piece of the work that we do is annually provide a performance report back to the legislature to say how clean water investments happen in the state. And not just the investments that come to our program, and not just the investments that go through the Clean Water Board, but all investments from federal agencies and state agencies to improve and protect water quality in the state. This team does a fantastic job tracking all of that, reporting all the investments, and then reporting all the outcomes of those investments, like water quality improvements and other performance metrics too. And then we've also done some work developing tools to help verify and inspect these investments or clean water projects once they're installed, to see how they're doing, and are they still sort of meeting our expectations and protecting our water quality. Today, we're kind of looking specifically about the funds that we administer. How do we as a program invest in clean water? We like to think of our funding across sort of the lifespan of a clean water project. The link we're going to provide in the chat is about a link to a recent Clean Water Lecture Series video, which really dives into this affectionately called Funding Rainbow. But broadly speaking, you know, we like to fund, we have granting programs that support finding projects. So we fund assessments like stormwater master plans or river corridor assessments. We fund work to advance those projects. So we have project development funds that, you know, support people's time to go knock on landowner doors or figure out what it takes, what permitting needs a project might need to scope it, or hiring an engineer to design it, or hiring the yellow machines to move the earth or plant the trees. So we have a lot of funds that kind of go into advancing the projects. We provide funds for taking care of projects, doing operation and maintenance. But really today I want to highlight, you know, the orange section, the funds to amplify best practices. And this is sort of where we've invested in piloting tools, providing trainings and workshops, developing and disseminating materials, and where we sort of conceptualize this capacity investment too. And I think that this ties back to our mission to make meaningful clean water investments. We need a capable network of partners to be able to make sure that our investments in all these other stages are actually effective and have an impact. So this is really a critical fourth leg of our stool in terms of how we make these investments. And then who do we work with? That goes back to that facilitate. We facilitate the restoration of Vermont's natural resources, but we're not out there with the shovels and we're not out there knocking on landowner doors. We really need our partners and we really need our funders. So this really highlights, we work across a range of different partners from other agencies, state and federal, to the landowners and the project managers and the environmental groups and the technical consultants. You all play a critical role in being part of this clean water network. And also, it might be useful to know that we work across sectors. So we fund investments in agriculture, we fund investments in natural resource work, like improving access for a river to its floodplain, or even, you know, green stormwater infrastructure projects on developed lands. And some of our partners work across those sectors, and some of those partners really have expertise in one specific sector. So we like to think broadly across all those sectors as well. So that was just a whirlwind tour of the Clean Water Initiative program. What is the Clean Water Workforce Capacity Development Project? I'm sorry, there's a lot of text on this slide, but this is our current draft project purpose. This does evolve through time, and I don't want to read the full thing, but I did underline key concepts, which is probably the full thing. But here's the key concepts that have really sort of guided how we've developed the project so far and where we see it going. The first is that we want to invest in the capacity of both current and potential partners. So when we're advancing this project, we want to think about what is the workforce today and what could it be? And are there ways to invite more folks to the table? So that's sort of informed some of the questions that we've had. We want to make sure that any investments we make are equitable and inclusive, and so we're looking for ways to understand what that means and how to do that. We want to make sure that we address unmet capacity needs. We recognize there's a lot of great funders in the state already providing capacity funding, and we didn't want to be duplicative. There's limited funds. We want to make sure we're really targeting where's the gap. Is the gap geographic? Is it the gap by certain organizations that have access to or don't have access to the current capacity funds? And then the output that we're looking for ultimately is this strong partnership network, right? That continues to efficiently deliver high quality and high priority clean water projects. So this is what the project is. Why are we doing this, or why are we doing this now? There's a ton of investment going into clean water in the state, in case you haven't heard. So there's some snippets here from news articles. As you can see, there's $63 million from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law Act going specifically to water infrastructure in Vermont. There's $100 million of American Rescue Plan Act dollars going into Vermont for water infrastructure. The clean water budget this year is managing almost $51 million going into clean water investments. And that's within 10 years since it started. That's more than a tenfold increase. So there's a very rapid increase of clean water funds coming into the state, and some of our partners are getting pulled in many different directions. So looking at the status, the Clean Water Initiative Program wants to make sure that our state and our partners can meet this upsized demand effectively, but also sustainably. We want to see if we can avoid any kind of boom and bust that this presents to our partners. So who are we talking about when we talk about the clean water workforce? We did develop a draft definition for phase 1 of this project that may be refined over time. Currently, we are calling the workforce something really as broad as we can, which is entities involved or who would like to be involved in promotion, identification, development, design, implementation, operation, maintenance, grant administration, anything sort of across the lifespan of a clean water project. So this is a really fancy diagram just to say, like, there's a lot of different steps across a clean water project and different entities can play different roles. Many partners may all be involved in advancing projects, but bring different skill sets. So we tried to create a definition just to start broad. This definition doesn't have any impact on sort of what resulting eligibility might be determined in terms of accessing grants in phase 2. But we did want to, again, emphasize this idea that we're looking at both current and potential. Are there opportunities to expand the workforce, or is it better suited for us to be focusing on the current workforce and investing in their capacity, or both? We're open to learning that.
Gianna, I hate to interrupt your flow. I just saw Dean dropped in the chat that he's not seeing the slides, so I just wanted to check in and see if others are facing a similar issue, or Dean, maybe suggest if you leave and rejoin, maybe it would work out the glitch. Looks like other folks. Okay, other folks are all set. Okay, yeah, Dean, if you want to try to just jump off and rejoin and then drop in the chat if you're still having issues. I can also send you a copy of the slides. Thank you.
Thanks, Emily. So we're on to the how. How are we advancing this project? And I'll divide that into the budgeting and the granting structure. So in terms of budgeting, to date, the Clean Water Initiative Program has secured just under about $700,000 from both state fiscal year 22 and 23. These are thanks to investments from both the Lake Champlain Basin Program and the Clean Water Board to invest in partner capacity. There is potential for slightly more in the short term. It sort of depends on how budgeting works out in the next 1 or 2 fiscal years. In terms of granting structure, this is a new concept for CWIP. So we started off with reviewing other capacity development programs, researching initiatives, and there's really a lot of ways this could go. You know, you could do direct grants, you can support trainings, develop, disseminate resources, facilitate peer-to-peer networks, make a lot of internal operational and policy streamlining work, a mix and match of those. But I think the key element of what we heard and learned by reviewing other projects or other capacity investment initiatives is that we need to be responsive to the needs of the workforce. We want to develop a funding opportunity that builds confidence that CWIP's using these limited funds in an equitable way and an impactful way, and that it's in alignment with the intent of the Clean Water Fund, and it can demonstrate impact. So today we divided this project tentatively only into 2 phases. We'll sort of hopefully keep it at only 2. So today's presentation is to talk about what we've done to date with phase 1 with the Clark Group, and Jess will present on that. But that really is designed to provide for some meaningful community engagement, to figure out what some of these gaps are in capacity needs for the clean water workforce, and some preliminary suggestions on investments or interventions. And then before we jump to phase 2, there's going to be a phase 2 design, internal work, where we really consider some of the recommendations coming out of phase 1, other community input and deliberate on the ideal structure of this grant making, how we mix and match, whether that's direct grants or other investments, and what that might look like. And then there will be a phase 2 delivery. So that's a summary of just some background. And now I'm going to pass it over to Jess to dive deeper into the phase 1 assessment. And I'm going to stop sharing. Okay. Let me know if you need help, Jess.
Okay, thank you. I think I should be good.
Great, we can see that.
Perfect. Okay. So thank you, Gianna. My portion of this presentation is going to cover our data collection objectives, chosen data collection methodology, some of our findings, and then next steps and an overview of the data analysis process. So we were tasked by CWIP to conduct an assessment through outreach to their current and potential partners to conceptualize the capacity challenges that need to be addressed and outline which investments in capacity building will lead to the adoption and implementation of more clean water projects statewide. So apologies for the text-heavy slide, but this is a list of 11 core questions that were developed by CWIP to inform the data collection process in an effort to achieve the goals of phase 1 of this initiative, which we used as a guide for our methodology. These 11 core questions are targeted at identifying opportunities to address and enhance both internal organizational capacity needs and overall workforce capacity needs. So again, the core questions were used as the framework for the design of the data collection methodology, but we were also provided with some other resources to inform this. We were provided with a list of other recent capacity assessments that CWIP is aware of for us to review so that we don't duplicate prior efforts and to make sure that we target our efforts toward the remaining knowledge gaps. We were also provided with a list of recommended contacts that included entities and individuals that CWIP staff regularly engage with on clean water work. And we use that to identify other potential entities to consult with on the design of the data collection process and to participate in the actual data collection. We also use the list of recommended contacts to further identify other entities to engage with, including those who have not previously interacted with CWIP. Surveys and interviews were both considered as potential data collection tools for this. The main distinction between the two being that surveys would allow for a larger quantity of participation, but interviews would allow us to gather more detailed information. So together with CWIP, we decided to go with the interview approach to allow us to dive deeper into some of the details of the bottlenecks and potential interventions and capacity issues. Interview participants were also assured that the interviews would remain anonymous to allow for more candid feedback, and also were assured that our report would not include any identifying information tying back to individuals or organizations. So in selecting the interview approach for data collection, we recognized that we would not be able to speak to all of CWIP's clean water partners in the time that we had available. So to account for this, we worked with CWIP to come up with a list of individuals to interview that would be able to represent diversity in a variety of factors, such as the types and sizes of organizations, involvement in different project sectors and stages, geographic representation, varying experience with and knowledge of Vermont clean water projects, and whether they were a current or potential CWIP grant funding recipient. So this slide is a visual overview of the pool of interview participants and their affiliated organizations with, again, the names redacted. And the key at the top shows some of the criteria that we use to identify this pool, including the different basins, sectors, types of groups, and geographic areas. So we identified 26 individuals to interview, and we tried several different modes of outreach to help encourage participation. For example, we gave them the option to do their interviews by phone, video call, or in person. And we also gave them the opportunity to provide written responses if they were not available for an interview during the allotted time frame. But given that, we were still only able to interview 22 due to some last minute scheduling conflicts and cancellations. So before the interview, participants completed a pre-interview survey with the intent of gathering more quantitative data about the organization to then use in our data analysis process, such as number of full-time staff, board members, seasonal staff, the types of clean water services they provide, the sectors they work in, and the geographic areas they work in. And before the interview, participants also received a primer to help them prepare, which included the list of interview questions and supplementary background materials to provide them with more context about the initiative. Interview questions were slightly tweaked for the non-traditional and potential interviewees who were new or unfamiliar with implementing clean water projects to make sure that the conversation was still meaningful. We also encouraged interview participants to invite their colleagues to share their own thoughts with them in response to the interview questions in preparation for the interview in order to maximize the feedback that we received. So 7 interview questions were developed, and interviews were designed to take approximately 1 hour. We conducted them over a 5-week period, and there was one consistent interviewer and note taker for all of the interviews to ensure consistency in our approach. Interviews are also recorded for our note-taking purposes, and interviewees were compensated for their time. Now we're going to move on to the findings, the preliminary findings, which are organized by each of the 7 interview questions. These include some of the main capacity challenges that interview participants identified, as well as interventions suggested by the interview participants to address those capacity challenges. I also wanted to note that while these findings include suggested interventions posed by interviewees, they don't include our recommendations, and we're still in the data analysis and draft report phase. So those recommendations will be in our final report. So for the first question, we asked participants about the types of projects they were pursuing and prioritizing and what that process looks like. In addition to that main question, there were also follow-up questions asked as appropriate, such as how do factors like your organization's mission, finances, staffing levels and skills, project size, or other external factors influence the projects that you pursue? So what we heard was from most interviewees that they rely on existing plans, such as tactical basin plans, river corridor plans, and stormwater master plans to identify the projects that they pursue. Some interviewees noted that there were regional gaps and varying degrees of access to these plans. For example, where there's a lack of watershed groups in a geographic area, there's often a lack of data, which can be expensive and time-consuming to gather. And this has an impact on those organizations' ability to identify projects more efficiently. We also heard that the grant application process is easier when projects are uploaded in the Clean Water Projects database. Most interviewees prioritize the projects they pursue based on the funding that is available. They said that they adapt the projects they pursue and prioritize in response to what the state is prioritizing and what they're putting funding out for. And many noted that they're interested in doing projects on private roads and driveways, invasive species removal, and dam removal, but the lack of available funding for or inadequate funding for those projects is a barrier. So it was suggested that DEC should increase funding levels for dam removals and include private roads and driveways and invasive species removal with eligible project funding types. Another thing that we heard was that the impact of available finances on staffing levels is one of the main driving factors for the projects that interviewees pursue. And finances influence the projects that interviewees pursue because staff need to balance their time fundraising and looking for grant funding and with developing and implementing projects. We also heard that staff retention makes a difference in interviewees' ability to pursue projects, and maintaining institutional knowledge that comes with staff retention allows them to take on more complex projects that take longer time to implement. For example, dam removal projects and brownfield remediation compared with more basic riparian projects. Some interviewees also noted that the requirement to pursue other sources of funding, such as Agency of Agriculture funding, before applying to DEC for funding reduces their capacity to do more projects because of the level of effort for that extra step. So one suggested intervention to tackle those capacity issues is to use the same funding process every year at the same time and establish a clear and consistent understanding of the rules and eligibility so that organizations can plan ahead and staff up accordingly. For the next question, we asked about how their work is funding existing needs not addressed with new or current funding opportunities. How might new funding programs make it easier or more challenging to do projects, and whether they utilize AmeriCorps to address their capacity needs. So most interviewee organizations pursue funding from a wide variety of state and federal grant programs and by fundraising from private sector sources. And we heard examples like the Lake Champlain Basin Program, Watersheds United Vermont block grants, Agency of Ag, Department of Transportation, Fish and Wildlife, and of course DEC. So some interviewees noted that they receive core funding that is not tied to projects, which makes a big difference in their ability to scale up and become more established. Other interviewees do not receive any core funding, which limits their ability to grow, take on additional projects, and take on larger, more complex projects because they don't have the staff capacity or cash flow to pay for those larger, more complex projects up front. We also heard that multi-year funding makes it easier for interviewees to hire staff and leverage additional funding to build organizational capacity, and that increasing staff capacity with other funding sources enables these organizations to more successfully engage with the DEC funding process. So one of the suggested interventions for this capacity need is to provide sustained funding to allow partners to staff up. And we heard that from the interviewees that use AmeriCorps, they use them primarily for field work and elements of project installation, but not as much project development. They don't necessarily receive AmeriCorps funding, but some receive an AmeriCorps person. And we heard that since it's only a one-year program and due to the temporary nature of their employment, interviewees lose the institutional knowledge every time they get a new person and have to spend additional time retraining new people each year. We also heard from some interviewees that they intentionally do not use AmeriCorps due to equity concerns regarding how much they are paid compared to the cost of living. We also asked interview participants whether they would be interested in growing to meet the increased demand and what they would need in order to do so. Many of them expressed interest in growing to meet the increased demand for clean water projects and noted that in order to do so, they need more paid staff. And they need assurance that if they commit to hiring new staff, that they'll be able to retain them. So one of the suggested interventions for this concern is to provide partners with overhead funding to enable them to hire more staff and pay for that staff time. Interviewees said they'll also need more dedicated project managers and administrative support as funding increases. As I mentioned before, a lot of staff members currently have to split their time between project and grant management with actual project work, making it really difficult for them to scale up the amount of projects that they're able to take on. And many express their need for more project managers that have the knowledge and skills necessary to obtain permits, oversee project implementation, and manage subcontractors. A few folks mentioned that managing multiple state and federal grants requires professional bookkeeping, and in some cases, a dedicated administrative staff person to administer those grants. And in addition to increasing administrative work for applicants, the clean water service providers will also need more administrative support. One of the suggested interventions here is to fund project manager positions with capacity funding, which would also help to ensure competitive salaries to recruit and retain qualified staff to hire for those positions. We also heard that predictability of the funding that's coming and how much is coming and where it's going would allow interviewees to staff up accordingly. And a few mentioned that there is sufficient project work identified in those plans that I mentioned earlier to justify them hiring more people, but they're unclear whether the amount of available funding will be able to support new staff salaries over multiple years. Another thing that we heard from a lot of interviewees was how essential the landowner outreach component is for implementing voluntary project and how it often requires a high level of effort. Even if you can identify a potential project on a map, you still have to get in touch with the landowner and they need to agree with the project. So there also was a need noted by several interviewees that they need more landowner outreach coordinators, and that these positions would ideally be filled by individuals that are tied to the communities that they're actually doing projects in. And again, interviewees emphasize the significance of the amount of time and effort needed to cultivate landowner relationships, conduct that outreach, and develop projects on private land, and how that required level of effort shouldn't be underestimated in trying to advance these voluntary projects. We also heard that staff turnover at the landowner outreach coordinator position can result in discontinuity of existing landowner relationships. So to improve landowner outreach efforts, it was suggested that DEC provide partners with landowner outreach training. Another thing we heard is that there are gaps in the number of engineers, designers, and in the statewide nursery stock needed in order for partners to scale up project development and implementation. There is a statewide tree nursery stock shortage, and that presents challenges for scaling up projects involving tree plantings, obviously. And to better ensure stewardship of the trees that do get planted, it was suggested that DEC fund more project maintenance after tree plantings to increase their survival rate. Another suggested intervention for the nursery stock shortage is to provide training in tree nursery botany to increase the amount of people with the skill set needed to operate tree nurseries. There was also a suggested intervention to address the gap in available engineers by providing interdisciplinary education and training for engineers to increase the number of them that have the skill sets needed to work in the clean water workforce. And to address the gaps in project designers, it was suggested that DEC develop a series of project design trainings for partners to use and take to train their own staff internally. And another thing we heard from the interviewees is a concern that the formula grant program is too focused on phosphorus reduction compared with other ecological co-benefits, because interviewees' organizational missions are inclusive of phosphorus reduction and water quality, but they also have broader organizational objectives that their projects contribute to. So several interviewees suggested that DEC consider increasing the co-benefit considerations in the formula calculation to address that concern. For non-traditional partners, we tweaked this question and asked whether they would be interested in engaging with this type of work. So among the non-traditional folks that we interviewed, what we heard in general is a lack of awareness about DEC's grant programs and funding opportunities, but there is interest. And opportunities for DEC and CWIP to engage with non-traditional interviewees include forestry sector projects, incorporating and considering new technology for removing phosphorus in best management practices, partnering with lakes and ponds associations, although I should note that these organizations face significant capacity challenges for engaging in this work because they are entirely volunteer-based, and increasing co-benefit considerations, because a sole funding focus on phosphorus reduction does present a barrier for non-traditional partner engagement, because their missions may also include water quality more broadly, but their projects are not set up to specifically target phosphorus reduction. So one of the suggested interventions is to improve the co-benefits analysis and encourage more non-traditional partner engagement by considering the broader ecological goals of Vermont's Clean Water Act outside of reducing phosphorus, and to leverage the expertise of other agencies in the Agency of Natural Resources, such as with fish and wildlife biologists, on the co-benefit metrics, criteria, and selection processes for DEC grant programs. Sorry, I got ahead of myself. One of the capacity issues that we heard from a couple of volunteer-based interviewee organizations is that they typically don't have the in-house resources needed to meet grant requirements. For example, quarterly reporting, which is a barrier to participation for some of those organizations. And this is why volunteer-based organizations are also non-traditional CWIP partners, even if they have mission statements with a clean water focus. And these interviewees would need paid staff for duties like project management, grant writing, grant management, and administrative support to engage more with DEC grant programs. So we asked interview participants about who their partners were, how they work together, what skills and services they provide one another, and what some ways to improve partner collaboration might be. So we heard from most interviewees that they have multiple regional and statewide government and nonprofit partners that they rely heavily on and that they leverage for fundraising and project planning capacity. Most of their relationships with their partners are more collaborative than they are competitive, and partners in the Clean Water Network often provide each other with leads on projects that they might be more suitable for. Interviewees also identified smaller volunteer-based groups as essential for recruiting volunteers for project implementation, and larger, more well-resourced groups as essential for planning and designing projects. We also heard from several folks that the tactical basin planning work has really helped bring people together and solidify partnerships. Interviewees noted that identifying and acknowledging the different skill sets and capacity of partner organizations would help promote more successful collaboration, especially given the new Clean Water Service Provider funding model. For example, historically, watershed groups and conservation districts have longstanding backgrounds and experience with all the necessary aspects of implementing voluntary clean water projects, such as coordinating with landowners. And those existing skill sets can be leveraged by the clean water service providers, who are in majority regional planning commissions that have more of a historical background in regulatory work. We heard about some gaps within the private sector for heavy machinery contractors in particular that have disincentivized some interviewees from sharing contacts and resources with other organizations. There are clean water education and training gaps in the heavy machinery contractor workforce that is really ideal for project installation. So to help address this, some interviewees suggested providing water quality trainings for this workforce and considering water quality training certifications for contractors. We also heard that it suggested that working with technical high schools and colleges to provide that workforce training could also help address that challenge. So as part of this initiative, CWIP is interested in learning about environmental justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, and we asked interview participants about opportunities and challenges in this area. Overall, we heard from interviewees that their organizations are supportive of pursuing opportunities to advance environmental justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, and interviewees are hoping DEC will take on a stronger leadership role in this space. For DEC to do that, they had some suggestions, such as providing training for all partners in the clean water workforce in this area, providing partners with HR resources or trainings to help them in the hiring process, including environmental justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion as part of DEC grant program co-benefits analysis, and providing partners with clear definitions and DEC's goals on environmental justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion so that they can start to identify their own roles and develop strategies. One of the issues that we heard from less resource interviewees is that their organization's inability to offer competitive salaries healthcare or retirement benefits, or in some cases, a livable wage, presents significant challenges for recruiting, developing, and maintaining a diverse workforce. We heard that the quality of life at many of these organizations is high, but some people simply cannot afford to stay in those positions. The lack of available, affordable housing also makes it difficult for interviewees to hire qualified personnel at the rate that they are able to pay. This also impacts the ability of organizations to hire people that live in the communities that they work in, which is particularly important for landowner outreach coordinator positions. Several interviewees also acknowledged that the demographics of the clean water workforce is generally mostly older and white, and many interviewees are struggling to recruit and retain younger, more diverse people on their staff and on their boards. So for the next interview question, we asked about the kinds of DEC support that have been the most helpful and whether there were any changes to DEC grant processes and policies that might help advance clean water project implementation. We heard that having access to DEC technical staff, such as river scientists, is particularly helpful in designing projects, and especially so for smaller, less resourced organizations. For example, some interviewees noted that they rely on and benefit from DEC staff attending site visits with them. And some interviewees noted that there are some gaps in DEC's technical staff capacity and that they're often spread thin, and so there's not always enough DEC staff available to provide this technical assistance. So to address this, it was suggested that DEC consider hiring more technical assistant staff. Interviewees also mentioned a variety of improvements to DEC's grant processes and policies that would help them implement more clean water projects. Many interviewees stressed the point that DEC's grant reporting requirements are overly burdensome for them, especially for small dollar projects, and that this is a barrier that both limits their capacity for project work or in some cases deters them from applying for DEC funding altogether. Interviewees noted that DEC's heavy involvement in the project development phase in particular slows down the process and that they would like some more flexibility during that phase. In some cases, the amount of paid staff time needed to complete grant deliverables like work plans and meet grant requirements like quarterly reports exceeds the grant amount for the project itself. And several interviewees mentioned that they would like to see more funding and support for project maintenance from DEC, which is particularly important to ensure factors like drought, heavy storms, or ice push have not degraded installed projects, and to enable partners to implement adaptive management strategies if needed to ensure that projects continue to function as intended. So suggested interventions to address these challenges by interviewees is reducing DEC's level of involvement at the project development phase, switching from quarterly reporting to annual reporting, streamlining DEC's current regulatory sign-off process requirements for each phase of a project, which several interviewees noted as a bottleneck for moving projects forward, providing upfront funding instead of using the reimbursement model, and providing more funding to use for project maintenance activities. We heard from interviewees that they prefer more flexible grant mechanisms, such as tactical basin planning funds and project development block grants. This type of grant model helps them pay for staff time and leaves more flexibility in the grant deliverable requirements. We heard from some interviewees that even if their organizations staff up, they would not be interested in applying for multiple small grants in order to do more projects. And they would prefer to receive a larger grant upfront that allows them to identify and develop multiple projects, which we heard as being more efficient for them to getting more projects done and requires them to spend less time on administrative work compared to pursuing separate grant funding for small individual projects. So to address those concerns, a suggested intervention is for DEC to allow applicants to package multiple projects together in one grant application. Interviewees also mentioned certain training opportunities that would help them advance implementation of clean water projects, such as providing training for all stakeholders on the clean water service provider funding model, on what the new funding mechanisms mean for their work, and on what the new processes are for clean water service provider funding. Training new staff responsible for project development on how to use the watershed projects database, and developing a project design training series were also mentioned as opportunities. So we closed out the interviews by asking an open-ended question on what else we should be considering in this capacity development initiative for both internal organizational needs and for the broader clean water network. Some interview participants used this question to re-emphasize capacity challenges they mentioned earlier in the interview, and others brought up new subject areas. So some interviewees noted that the reliance on volunteer-based organizations can be a barrier to advancing the implementation of clean water projects. These organizations sometimes lack the technical capacity to take on more complex projects or the capacity needed to administer government grants, since they don't have that professional project management or administrative bookkeeping capacity. Another challenge that we heard is that without paid staff, there's a lack of consistency in the landowner point of contact for these organizations, making it more difficult for them to cultivate the landowner relationships needed for voluntary project development. In addition, having no paid staff is a barrier for these organizations to recruit new volunteer members. Several interviewees also stressed and re-emphasized the difference between voluntary versus regulatory project considerations. And for example, how voluntary projects require that landowners sign off, and there's a lot of engagement work that goes into getting voluntary projects implemented compared to what's required for regulatory projects. And they just stress that these differences should be considered when trying to advance the adoption of voluntary projects. And lastly, some interviewees expressed the need to strengthen DEC's enforcement of the Shoreline Protection Act, since Clean Water Partners do not have the jurisdiction to enforce laws like that act themselves. They're looking for more support from the state on this issue, and a number of interviewees said that DEC does not have enough enforcement staff capacity. So those are the initial findings. For next steps, we are currently in the data analysis phase, which consists of compiling our interview notes and tagging the feedback that we heard with the related core questions that we talked about in the beginning of this presentation, identifying capacity needs and suggested interventions in the interview notes, and organizing that feedback to answer CWIP's core questions, evaluating and prioritizing the suggested interventions from the interviews with CWIP's considerations for priority interventions that they developed for us to use as a framework for evaluating the top capacity investment priorities, and then using that evaluation to provide recommendations for CWIP to consider for phase 2 of this initiative. And with that, I will hand it back to Gianna.
Great. Thank you so much, Jess. And I'm going to pull back up the slide for the last few pieces here. And while that is loading, I do want to say thank you so much to all the interviewees that took time to help give us that feedback. And thank you so much to all the partners that also worked with the Clark Group to provide input on the interview questions. We really, truly appreciate your time in helping provide some considerations for us. And I also want to thank Jess and the Clark Group for the work that you've done so far in really interpreting some very sector-specific lingo and turning it into some meaningful results there. So what is next? What are next steps for us? Let's see, let's get to that slide. And I did see some chat, a little bit of confusion in the chat about what slide we were on. And I am trying a new thing where we're directly sharing the PowerPoint slides. So there should be a little button in the bottom left for you that you can click that says sync to presenter, because this allows you to actually move across all the slides. But if you want to get back to where we are, you click sync to presenter. And so I apologize for not mentioning that up front. But to wrap up, what are our next steps and some time for Q&A, plenty of time for Q&A. As Jess was alluding to, there's still some work we'd like to do on phase 1. We did give the Clark group a list of considerations for interventions, really kind of a lot of thoughts about, we have some great suggested interventions. Which of these maybe are best scaled for the available funds, which are going to address, you know, the most pervasive needs, which fill the gaps that aren't already addressed, which are likely to have the most sustainable impact over time. So those are the sorts of considerations that Jess is alluding to. And then that's sort of the analysis of taking those suggested interventions against that and saying, okay, how do they fit through that screen in that film, and then come up with a formal report with some formal recommendations. So that's on the Clark group's desk, and they'll be working on a formal report that they'll be sending to us, and we'll be able to make available in the next month or two as that wraps up. In the meantime, once this presentation is uploaded to YouTube, we will share it around along with a link to a feedback survey. And we will share it around through our grants notification listserv, link provided in the chat, as well as on our website page, link also provided in the chat. We would request, if you have any thoughts or reflections on the findings so far, to please provide that feedback to us by December 2nd. And that sort of all goes into our work designing phase 2. We'll take the recommendations from the Clark group. We'll take some consideration from the survey. We'll sort of reevaluate where things stand in terms of need and start to structure out what the granting structure will look like for phase 2. It's hard to say the timing for phase 2 delivery, but I will say that in general, when if and when grant opportunities are available, we release them, request for proposals and the like, through the Vermont Business Registry. We also announce them on the grants notification listserv. So again, please sign up for both of those if you aren't already signed up for those, if you're curious about how this is moving forward or for funding opportunities as they become available. And then the last thing I would like to flag for your awareness is that, as we mentioned, this is funded in part through the Clean Water budget process. State fiscal year 24 is about to launch a public comment period. And in the chat, we're providing a link to the Clean Water Board website and the other listserv we manage, which is the Clean Water Stakeholder listserv, where you can learn how to participate and provide input to the board. And that concludes our presentation. And so we have a full hour or 5 minutes, depending on how much we need, to see if there are any questions. I can start with what's in the chat. And I think other than technical issues, maybe it's Neil. Did you want to talk about AmeriCorps?
Thank you. This is really great. I really appreciate the analysis and being able to see the opportunities presented by our stakeholders. And there's a lot of good people. And I'm actually struck by a number of the names that I don't know in the attendee list. So I think you mentioned about some training around Act 76 and related grant programs. That resonates. But I wanted to come back to the AmeriCorps. It feels, it's just a thought, but it feels a shame. And I'd be interested to hear from some of the partners on the line here, that we wouldn't be able to, in some manner, involve AmeriCorps members in project development activities, because it seems like it's such good professional training. I think there's at least one, if not two people that are attending today that are actually professional staff members of various organizations that were once Eco-AmeriCorps members. So I was just kind of curious if that point resonated more broadly or if that was a more narrow point.
Yeah, Claire.
Hi, I'm happy to maybe give a little bit of feedback on that point. I think, and just to introduce myself, I'm the finance director for the Vermont Association of Conservation Districts and a 4-time AmeriCorps member. So my perspective on this is I agree that it's a wonderful opportunity for AmeriCorps members to participate in that kind of activity. That said, I think what we would find is that we would need more support or our staffing costs in order to be able to effectively engage with them, to provide just the number of hours of training and oversight that they often need to be effective and supported in their work. So I think that's would be a limitation on our end, is just, can we free up existing staff time to support those members? And in order to do that, we would likely need sources of unrestricted or more flexible types of funding.
Thank you. That's definitely helpful. Well, fair enough, Gianna. Thank you for the opportunity to ask the question.
Sure. Thanks for the question, Neil. And I see your other comment. Did you want to say anything else about some of the Lake Champlain Basin program investments?
Oh, yeah, that might be a little bit inside baseball, but Jess Weimer, because you mentioned that some folks had mentioned the lack of availability of nursery stock and of nursery, basically a more solid nursery program around the state. The Lake Champlain Basin program has recognized that and is investing a full $1 million of their infrastructure funding into the development of nursery capacity just this year. I don't know what type of outreach they're doing around that or how that program is coming together, but I know that it is. So.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Neil. And appreciate the inside baseball. Always fun to be on the inside. Are there any other questions? And just as a primer, the survey will be asking if there were certain capacity challenges that you heard that you really want to amplify, or that you didn't hear and want to make sure we're aware of. If there were interventions that you heard you agree with, you want to amplify, or ones you didn't hear. And any other, concerns or thoughts about our approach to phase 1, and then more broadly to the project. So that's the gist of the questions we'll be asking everyone, both internal to DEC and external, to provide us feedback on. So that there's space to do that there. Are there any other questions today? Michelle Braun is saying we could use board training. Michelle, would you like to expand on that at all, on the types of training you'd like to provide for the board?
I think Jess spoke earlier to the challenges of volunteer-run organizations and versus staffed organizations. And our organization is staffed, but still ultimately directed by a volunteer board. And we have awesome board members who have relevant experience in the field, but they definitely would benefit from training in, nonprofit management, financial management, for instance, and organization building, strategic planning, that kind of thing.
Great. Thank you, Michelle. And are you thinking training specifically to the board or specific to staff to build their board capacity?
Making training available to boards, I think, would be really beneficial. I don't know that it exists.
Doug?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank everybody and thank you in particular for putting on this presentation. It's really helpful to see the diverse range of perspectives and opinions on this. I think, there are some things in here that are going to be beyond our control, and we can, I know a lot of the state and federal requirements are not things that can easily be adjusted, but there's also a lot of things in there that could lead to improvements. So I really appreciate DEC doing this work and constantly working to improve your delivery of clean water outcomes. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Doug.
Thank you, Doug.
And thank you, Rachel McKimmey is an Eco-AmeriCorps with the CWIP program. We're so excited to have her, and she's offered to answer any Eco-AmeriCorps questions from that perspective. Thank you, Rachel. Okay, I see SB
Hi, I'm Sadie with the Poultney Meadowy Conservation District. And I was just wondering if there were any like regional gaps that you saw more on a geographic scale, or if some of these suggestions were coming from across the state.
Thanks, Sadie. Jess, have you folks been able to analyze your responses by region?
We heard about some regional concerns and then more broad statewide concerns, but that sort of information will definitely be in the report.
You did take account, like you were saying, Jess, of the pre-interview survey, so you could get a sense of where these folks were serving. And so that's part of when you're alluding to being in the report, like maybe we'll be able to get some sense of that. But certainly, Sadie, if you are seeing regional gaps that you would like to highlight, please mention that in the survey feedback. Neil, you're muted.
Indeed. Thank you. Jess, I have another question for you. You probably spoke to it a little bit. I'm just curious the intensity with which you heard it. One of the things that's on my mind is, you know, the Clean Water Initiative program in the state. We've got a bunch of grant programs, but there are other programs out there. You know, we have state dollars going to block grants. Then we've got federal dollars going to through the Lake Champlain Basin program, for example. There's, you know, funding coming from other areas as well, like Natural Resources Conservation Service. And even outside of the agricultural space, which I know you didn't focus in on too much. I'm curious if you heard the sort of problems with like the collision of those funding sources or timing about application periods. That's definitely something that's on my mind in this here and now in the next 2 to 3 years of, you know, big infrastructure funding that's available.
I don't think we heard too much about that other than the level of effort that is required in managing multiple different either state or federal grants, and just the time and the effort that they need to put in to do all of that grant management.
Great, thanks.
That does remind me, Neil, those if anyone on this call as an agency is going to offer capacity support or is thinking about it, would love to connect and coordinate our funding in any feasible way. And so please reach out. My contact information is on this slide. We hear that it is hard to apply for lots of different funds, and we certainly don't want to make capacity funds, if they are going to be direct grants, an additional complexity. Any other thoughts or questions? Well, great. Oh, yes, Claire.
I'm so sorry to jump in here at the last minute. I want to thank you for doing this effort. I know that it took a significant amount of time and coordination on your part to pull this together, and I think that the insights are going to be really useful, so I look forward to the report. I think one thing I would say, just as you further analyze the data, is I think one thing I've heard a little bit on my end is that some of the folks I'm aware of who are most strapped for capacity found themselves unable to participate in this process, and so there might be a little bit of a irony
Interesting.
in that the people who lack capacity the most were least able to participate. So I don't know how to address that. I realize you can only work with the information that you have, but just wanted to put that on your radar and maybe just have that in the back of your mind as you continue looking at this information.
Great.
Claire, are you able to share not the identities, but maybe the nature of some of the groups that you have in mind? Because I mean, maybe some targeted follow-up if the contract would allow it could be, you know, we could do.
Sure. So I represent the conservation districts. Those are the folks I'm in most contact with. Though of course we work in close partnership with others like the Watershed, Watersheds United Vermont. So mostly when my statements are mostly about the conservation districts. And And I realize that, you know, a 2-hour meeting or, you know, one survey doesn't seem like an awful lot, but we are facing a lot of requests for information coming in from all directions. And so that's the context that this initiative took place within from our perspective is there's just so much happening. This is, I have been in meetings today straight through since 8 a.m. because there are so many, you know, initiatives that are happening. So again, thank you so much. And I'm really looking forward to the report, but just wanted to put that on your radar.
Thank you, Claire. Okay. Well, I really thank all of you for your time today and joining enthusiastically, even for a 2-hour meeting, although we wrapped up much earlier, so I'll give you back 50 minutes. Again, our next steps, as the Clark Group is wrapping up their final report, we will be uploading this recording, sharing it around via our grants notification listserv along with the survey link. So please sign up for the listserv. Please look for that link. Please give us more feedback if you have the time to do so. And our contact information is on this slide if you have any follow-up thoughts or questions. Thank you so much for your time and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Nice job.
Thank you.